Hi friends, and welcome to the online Consent Culture and Contact Improvisation Symposium. We have gathered some of the top innovators and thinkers around this important topic to share their ideas, push the conversation forward, and inspire inclusive consent-focused CI practices. Each presenter has made a video to precede the live symposium to share the essence of their ideas so you can become familiar with their thinking. We will go deeper during the live event, sharing ideas, having discussions, and experiential exercises. The following video is by Nicole Bindler, and their presentation is called Beyond Sex, Consent as Liberation. Enjoy.
Hello, my name is Nicole Bindler. I'm a contact improvisation teacher, body-mind centering practitioner, activist, writer, and I wear a bunch of other hats, including co-organizer of this Consent Culture and CI Symposium, along with Deirdre Morris and Vivek Patel. I'm also a presenter and will be offering some pieces of information from my curriculum, Beyond Sex, Consent as Liberation. And just to go over briefly the outline of what we'll be doing, first I'll share a bit more about who I am and why I do this work. And then we'll do a solo embodied consent exercise. Then I'll define some terms that I'll be using in the theory part and share some observations and challenges that I've witnessed in various CI communities around the world. Then I'll talk about some embodied strategies for culture shift and share some exercises for CI teaching around consent. In the outline, the next section, you'll see our resources and inspiration, so some articles that I'm sharing with you that I won't be going into in detail in this session, but they're there for you as a reference. And then I'll talk a bit about visioning for the future and how we'll do that together in our live in-person Zoom session. And then we'll return to the solo embodied consent exercise and see how we feel. So I've been practicing contact improvisation for 23 years. I started in college and I've been teaching for 17 years. And I fell in love with form. And in my first year of studying in college, one of my classmates was flirting with me in a way that I had not invited and did not want. And I brought it up with my professor and asked if we could address boundaries and safety in class, to which she replied that she didn't feel comfortable addressing that in the circle because she had a concern that if we addressed grievances and social issues in class, that we would end up amplifying those issues by shining a light on them. And this is something that I continue to hear among some people who have resistance to doing work around consent culture and contact improvisation, that if we spend too much time processing our issues, that we won't have enough time for dancing, or that we might actually end up inadvertently creating more issues, somehow manifesting issues by talking about them. I disagree. This is why I'm co-organizing this symposium in the first place, but I do think that that kind of response is still quite prevalent, or prevalent enough that I think it deserves being addressed. So that's at the crux of why I do this work. And to go a little more deeply into why I do social change work at all within dance spaces is that I feel that working interdisciplinarily, like in political ways and in embodied ways, that for me, I feel that I'm more able to really affect change by trying to do that change work in communities that I'm already embedded. So for example, doing diversity, equity, and inclusion work within contact improvisation, I feel that because of my pre-existing relationships and commitment to the form, that my work is going to have more impact. So what led me to teaching my curriculum, Beyond Sex, Consent as Liberation, was really about wanting to look at consent culture from an intersectional lens, which I'll get into that definition in a little bit, but to really start to explore how, in order to successfully do diversity, equity, and inclusion work, we need to look at the ways that a lack of consent culture contributes to exclusivity and inequity. So why is it that certain people from certain populations don't come to CI classes and jams, even though they might be interested in the form? And looking at the ways that freedom and bodily autonomy, or a lack thereof, can really inform people's ability to participate. So there's been a situation in my hometown community where there's been a community member who was repeatedly harassed and even assaulted other participants. But some of the organizers have felt resistant to banning this person, even though we've had multiple interventions, because of a fear of infringing on somebody's freedom or infringing on somebody's right to show up and be a part of the community, not wanting to shun, which I think comes from an authentically good place. And I think that banning somebody should be an absolute last resort. However, in looking at the number of people who don't come because this person is there or other people who do similar behaviors are there, it really starts to call into question this idea of freedom, like whose freedom? So that's something that has really catalyzed my interest in doing this work and in developing this curriculum and working in different communities. I started to notice so many similar issues arise, and I'm so excited about our time together on the Zoom, where we can put our heads together and, share grievances and problems and see what kinds of threads or through lines there are, and also maybe differences depending on the different concerns of our communities, and to really together visualize and come up with solutions. So I'm going to read right now just a little bit of the description of this session, just as a reference for you, to give you some more grounding and understanding about what we're doing. So this lecture offers an intersectional approach to cultivating consent culture within CI spaces by addressing the ways that everyone, but particularly those who come from marginalized populations, has a need for bodily autonomy and freedom of movement. In CI spaces, people who hold minority identities, including but not limited to people of color, queers, and folks with disabilities, in addition to experiencing overt bodily trespasses, are often subject to more subtle coercion by those who hold dominant identities, to conform to unspoken and sometimes unconscious social norms. To build truly consensual spaces, we must broaden our definition of consent to include more nuanced analyses around power dynamics, conformity, and assimilation in our communities. Okay. So just also a caveat, at the time of this presentation, we are in the midst of a global pandemic, after which I have no idea what contact improvisation is going to be like. So I can only hope that the underlying theory of this session and this symposium as a whole is still going to be relevant, because so much of what we're talking about is really about power and identity. And I don't think that those things are going to go away, even if the way that we approach contact improvisation does change. Okay, so the sun is changing in my room. My hair is starting to dry from my shower. And I'm going to invite you to just notice yourself in your room, wherever you are. Notice the space, the architecture, where you are in the room, and ask yourself, do you like where you are in the room? Maybe you have no choice. Maybe it's the only place to sit. But if you do have any choice around where you are in the room, or any choice around which room you might want to be in, just take note of where you are, and is that where you want to be? Is there a place that might be more comfortable, more soothing, perhaps a vantage point that feels more aesthetically pleasing, or you have some sort of kinesthetic response to where you are in the space that might not have any kind of rational explanation? And if you feel interested in shifting where you are, please do so now. And if you feel like staying where you are, you can do that as well. And wherever you are in your space, notice your posture, your breathing, the shape of your body, the relationship of your body to your seat, to the floor. And notice if there are any shifts that you want to do internally to make yourself more comfortable. And notice if you feel nourished, if you feel fed, if you feel thirsty or hydrated. Do you need to go to the bathroom? Remember that you can always pause this video and notice how even in a solo practice, how we sometimes override our needs. And just imagine how exponentially challenging that can become when suddenly another person or people are involved in our decision making. So just taking another moment to settle into where you are and how you are, noticing any choices you have about that, and just remembering that you can take care of yourself during this session. Okay, so now I'm going to define some terms for you, some working terms that could be subject to change because language changes as culture changes, but these are some of the terms that I'm using now as a way of understanding some of the concepts I'm working with. So the first term is consent. What is consent? Consent is permission for something to happen or agreement to do something. It's about the future, not the past. It's often discussed in the context of sex, but I prefer to look at it through an analysis of power across many different identities. And because of inherent power dynamics between people of different identities, I don't actually think it's possible to ever have a perfectly foolproof instance of consent. This might sound like a kind of a controversial assertion. I don't actually think of it as a problem. This is why we often describe our spaces as, or our aspiration to create our spaces as safer rather than safe. So in any given interaction, in any given relationship, there's usually some power differential around age, occupation, some dynamic in the relationship, or around how the identities of the two people interface in terms of outside society and how they're perceived, or their histories. And so in light of this, there's always a potential for some subtle, perhaps inadvertent coercion. And there's always a potential for us to override our needs for the sake of maintaining a relationship or maintaining our standing in a community. And to me, this work is not really about creating some kind of perfect utopia where everyone's always 100% authentic and always getting what they need, but rather that we're aspiring to create a culture of consent in which those who are in positions of more power in any given context are aware of their positionality, aware of their power, and doing everything that they can to bring consciousness to any power dynamics that could be showing up. So we're never going to do it perfectly. We're never going to be perfectly right with this work, but it's just about building more consciousness and awareness. Consent culture is a commitment to developing practices, processes, and structures to ensure that everyone has bodily autonomy and the opportunity to opt in or out of activities. It requires a community-wide power analysis that addresses how those who have marginalized identities face particular challenges and have distinct needs around their personal space and participation. Marginalized identity is the treatment of a person or group as peripheral by decentering their presence, ideas, or needs. Dominant identity is the belonging to a group that is considered the baseline or norm for a society. Social privilege refers to the ability of those with dominant identities to feel comfortable and at ease in social spaces without questioning their belonging. So one thing that's often so confusing about the idea of privilege is that when somebody is holding privilege in any instance, it's often invisible to them. It's almost like the absence of sensation. It doesn't feel like anything except for being comfortable. And being comfortable is not something that we often register. So if we walk into a space in a community where we are of the dominant identity, or many of the people in the space, share an identity, there can be a kind of ease with which we navigate this space. We don't have to code switch. We don't have to change our behavior or be hypervigilant or aware of how people are perceiving us. And so part of the work of those with dominant identities who care about consent culture and care about diversity, equity, and inclusion is to start to dial up our awareness and our listening for moments when we might be carrying privilege, and it's often really hard to even detect that. A microaggression is a subtle, often unintentional act of disrespect or discrimination against someone who has a marginalized identity that dehumanizes them and or makes them feel unsafe. Liberation is the act of setting someone free from imprisonment, slavery, or oppression so that they have freedom from limits on thought or personal behavior. So again, in reference to the situation in my hometown, I've often heard concern from some people around limiting freedom, and that if we focus on consent culture, that it might feel like micromanaging people's behavior. It could diminish spontaneity. And so, my urge to people who feel a sense of resistance to any limiting of their freedom, my response is to consider the freedom of those whose needs are rarely addressed or often eclipsed by the desires of those from dominant identities who have been socialized to believe that their wants are most important. So again, those of us who have dominant identities, and I say us because I am a white cisgender person, I have been socialized in a lot of ways to believe that my wants and desires are really important. So those of us who have more privilege tend to be less conscious about how we're occupying or moving through space. And that's because we're not required to be aware in order to survive, whereas those who come from more marginalized groups often need to be very aware, observant, and even hyper-vigilant for their own survival. So learning how to bring awareness to the ways that we might be limiting others' freedom can in fact be liberating for all of us. Because privilege is actually a dissociation or a lack of connection to ourselves and others. And for this reason, those of us who come from more dominant populations need to dial up our listening and get curious and more actively ask questions about how our dances are going, how our dance partners feel. And then lastly, I'll just mention that because of the evolutionary freeze response, and if you're interested in polyvagal theory, you can geek out and get really deep into these ideas. I'm just going to reference that here. But the fact is that when some people aren't feeling safe, a common physiological response is a freeze response that prevents them from saying no. This is something that can occur in the body that is completely beyond our conscious control. And so because of that, we can't always assume that someone's silence is an implicit yes. Okay. The next term, intersectionality, is a term coined by Kimberly Crenshaw as a way of understanding how those with multiple marginalized identities face complex and multifaceted challenges. Through an intersectional lens, we see that everyone benefits from a strong consent culture. So some people, because of who they are unable to participate in contact improvisation without the presence of a power analysis and consent culture. So I'm going to give you some examples of individual identities, not intersectional identities, but individual identities that can be impacted by a lack of consent culture in CI and impacted by microaggressions that can show up in CI spaces. So for example, people of color, especially Black people's bodies are under attack every day in both micro and macro ways. And touch can feel like violence if it's not approached with care, respect, and listening. I often see Black people subject to non-consensual touching of their skin and hair, or generally being exotified. So my question to you all to contemplate is, how might that play out in CI spaces and contribute to the common lack of people of color in CI communities? And even though I'm in the United States and coming from a US lens around race, I think that it does apply internationally, and I think that anti-Black racism is something that we see internationally. Even in countries that are predominantly comprised of Black people, there's still a colorism where the people who are the darkest tend to receive the most discrimination. So I think that that can be relevant across the board, though of course it shows up in different ways in different places. Another example, transgender and non-binary people often have their gender identities and correct pronouns denied, and sometimes experience dysphoria that necessitates freedom to have certain body parts be off limits to touch. I mean, honestly, I think that applies to everyone. I think we all should have the right and the freedom to have certain body parts off limits to touch at any time without explanation or apology. However, because of the common experience that transgender and non-binary people have around being misgendered or treated strangely because their gender identity isn't like recognized in mainstream society. I think that the fact that contact improvisation is touch-based and so intimate means that if we want to actually have spaces that are inclusive of transgender, non-binary people, we need to start to really think about how we can use consent culture to create opportunities for more and more communication about how and when we touch. Okay, so people with physical disabilities are often dehumanized and not allowed the dignity of choosing when and how they need accommodations, and well-intentioned able-bodied people sometimes handle the bodies of those with physical disabilities without having even received a request for help. And last example, people who struggle with PTSD, sensory processing issues, and other invisible cognitive disabilities often have different needs around the quality of touch and the timing. And they need the freedom to opt in and out of dances or negotiate a change of speed or quality in the middle of a dance without apology or explanation. And of course, again, this applies to everybody, but just to understand that different populations, different people who have different life experiences might have like amplified needs for certain kinds of accommodations around consent and touch. So having listed just a few individual identities, just imagine for a moment intersecting identities, which we all have. We all have multiple identities, and also our identities change depending on what community we're in. And just imagine the layers of complexity that arise when we have these intersecting identities and we're all together in community and trying to move together in a touch-based form. It's very complex. So in the next section, I'm going to go over some observations and challenges that I've seen in various communities around these kinds of issues around identity. So I've been offering my training and classes, Consent is Liberation, internationally in 6 different countries and throughout the United States. And I've noticed, interestingly, a lot of common issues show up in these different places. So people in every community that I've worked in have cited difficulty in maintaining healthy boundaries and guidelines around consent to varying degrees. Some communities are much further along than others. And in many cities, at some point in my classes, this happens almost every time, but not every time, but almost every time. At some point, a white cisgender male participant has disrupted class to demand either less talking, more dancing, or to request different music or a different exercise. And I interpret these kinds of interruptions as either conscious or unconscious means to derail the process of learning about consent so that they don't have to engage with their power and privilege and complicity in systemic boundary violations within CI. In one city, a white cisgender man hollered, "You're being divisive," to me in a class when I asked the participants to consider their racial and gender identities and how that interacts with other dancers. So that was a kind of extreme example of somebody resisting. Okay, so after several of my classes, I've seen white cisgender men line up to talk with me, sometimes cutting in front of people with other identities, more marginalized identities. And often in this line of men, sometimes it's appreciation and genuine interest in engaging, and sometimes it really involves posing questions or challenging my ideas or expressing anger. So in one of these instances, a white cisgender man attempted to engage me in a really long private post-class discussion about his sense of shame and alienation in CI and how he found the Me Too movement to be male shaming. So I'm just listing a lot of patterns that I've seen in terms of resistance, and it can be, I don't know, you might have feelings coming up, I have feelings coming up, and sharing all of this. And just know that we will get to the good part. We'll get to the part with some solutions and some strategies. But I'm gonna go through just a few more of some of the patterns that I've seen show up around resistance. So after one of my consent classes in a different city, a man came up to me and rubbed me on the shoulders. that was pretty amazing and shocking. In one of my classes, a man sharked a woman, so he was circling around her, and it was a class explicitly around consent, so I disrupted it and, asked some questions about what was going on there. And afterwards, the woman who was being circled, she internalized the experience and claimed that his circling did in fact make her feel uncomfortable, but that she interpreted it as the reason being that she has emotional baggage. So that really shined a light for me around some of the ways that patriarchy can be internalized, and that any of us can uphold patriarchy, that patriarchy is not synonymous with men. In one community that I worked in, there was a very strong emphasis on learning how to say no. But a lot of the people had not considered the fact that, for example, a young person might have challenges saying no to a high status teacher because of what that might do for their standing in the community. So that's a common theme that I find in communities, is wanting to override the process of looking at power and just trying to train people, or asking for training around how do we say no, which is certainly important. But as I've addressed in terms of polyvagal theory, that sometimes when people are in a freeze response, that it's actually really hard to find one's no. So another community that I came in to teach at, I noticed that the community was comprised of almost entirely young people, and I asked them about that, and some of them said, oh yeah, there have been older people who have shown up, but no one really dances with them, so they don't come back. And that was really interesting to me in terms of just thinking about the ways that sometimes there's a disconnect around wishing for a more diverse community, but not wanting to take the steps to actually make that happen. And in another community, I noticed that the majority of the people who showed up to my consent classes were women and non-binary people. And they themselves made that observation, and they were very disappointed that the men hadn't shown up, particularly men who are leaders in the community. And they didn't know how they were going to really shift the responsibility. They felt that they were bearing the burden of both being the ones who were subject to oppression and also the ones who had to deal with the emotional labor of processing it and finding solutions. So that's also a really common problem that I've seen in terms of who's bearing the brunt of these conundrums. So in the next section, I'm going to give some strategies and offerings for how to deal with these problems. So now I'm going to offer some embodied strategies for culture shift. And I'm sorry to say that I don't actually have very specific bulleted points to share with you about, like, this is what you need to do to make your community safer and braver and more inclusive, because every community is different in terms of its makeup of different identities, its history, the values. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to just give some offerings of questions that I ask communities when I go in and do consulting and support. And hopefully in thinking through these questions, the solutions are going to arise from there. So they'll emerge. Okay, so the first question that I have for you, for all of us, is how can you titrate the change in learning so your community can grow together with maximum buy-in and without too much panic, discord, and drama? So in other words, how can the largest portion of the community be invited into the change process? So oftentimes resistance to change can arise because people feel like they got left behind. They didn't get the memo. They weren't able to participate in the process. They didn't have a voice. And so sometimes even just giving opportunities for people to voice their concerns or their needs can really just create a world of good around buy-in and goodwill. So some of the ways that you could achieve this are, one thing that I did in my community was I actually offered an anonymous survey. And I got a lot of really interesting information about why a lot of people haven't shown up in a while. And it was illuminating. I think that a lot of the people who responded might not have responded as candidly had it been out in the open in a public forum or in an email thread. So I do think that offering an opportunity to give anonymous feedback can be a really wonderful way for facilitators to invite people to be candid. And it is a vulnerable thing to receive anonymous feedback because sometimes it can be intense to read. And also, it doesn't obligate facilitators to respond to the needs of everyone's grievance, but I think it can be a really great way to get candid feedback. But I think in addition to that, having public forums where people can actually sit together face to face and share what they're interested in, the directions they want to go in, what their values are, for people to really be in dialogue in real time and to understand in the Venn diagrams, like where people's values meet, where the intersections are. So this is pretty process heavy, and oftentimes, facilitators and teachers are doing a lot of volunteer labor as it is. It can feel kind of overwhelming to be setting up these meetings and asking people questions and asking for feedback. I would say that, finding a balance between capacity and not taking on too much emotional labor, but also realizing that an investment in this now can actually minimize labor long term. So, for example, if you have like a big drama or a big blowout in your community around a consent violation that's going to involve a lot of mediation and a lot of processing over many, many hours, some of that could actually be avoided by doing some more work on the front end in terms of building relationships, building shared understanding, and then moving into creating actual structures and processes. So I just talked a bit about buy-in and inclusivity and really like bringing people in and getting their voices and opinions. But conversely, at what point does it make sense for leadership to actually take the reins and enforce changes for the sake of the well-being of those who are marginalized or have been harmed? So a lot of times when we talk about power and privilege, it can kind of sound a bit like power is a bad thing. I don't think that power is a bad thing. I think it's inherent in this world that we live in. I think that having consciousness around power dynamics is ideal. And I think that those who are in positions of power, people who are gatekeepers like teachers, organizers, those who have the passwords to the email lists, and the ones who do the communication and set the tone, I think that actually leveraging or using that power in a positive way can actually be a really liberatory thing. So I think that sometimes when those of us who are in positions of power, and I include myself in that, having been a teacher for a while, when we deny that we have this power, when we say, oh, we really just want to have this level horizontal field, it's a way of abdicating responsibility. And I think that it's actually a more caring and loving thing to our communities to take the power, to own it, and to say, I'm going to use this power toward creating systems and structures that are going to benefit the most people and are also going to lift up or support those who have traditionally not had as much of a voice. Okay, so, wow, my stomach is rumbling. It's dinner time. Hope you didn't hear that. So if there are rifts or unexplored power dynamics within the community leadership around the necessity of consent culture, how can that be resolved? So, we can never assume that all the people in leadership, usually we have teams of people. I mean, in maybe smaller communities, there's one organizer, but in most communities, there are several organizers. Maybe they're working separately on different events, but oftentimes organizers are convening in different ways and coordinating, at least to make sure their events aren't happening at the same time. And so if we have leaders and communities who disagree on even the necessity to focus on consent culture, there are a couple of different ways that we can address that. So one way to address that is to do some political organizing. So grassroots organizing involves relationship building, education, advocacy, and I don't mean yelling at people and saying, you're wrong, I'm right. But what I mean is actually bringing people in with real human stories. So again, like a anonymous survey, and reading people's stories of those who had felt harmed or alienated or not seen, and getting that information in terms of the actual impact of a lack of consent culture in a community can change minds and hearts. And also, when I say lack of consent culture, just to be clear, I'm not saying that it's black and white. It's not like, oh, this community has it, this community doesn't have it. I think we're always like, on some end of the spectrum. Though actually, if you do want to give yourself a good assessment, that there's a tool in the articles in the outline that I'm sharing with you about how to assess your community's level of consent culture. So if you have, wow, that was a really loud grumble. I probably should take a break soon and have a snack. And you should too. You should also take a break and have a snack or a rest if you need to. So if you feel like, you're at odds with some, facilitators, co-facilitators in your community, and you feel like you can't really come to an agreement around the necessity of building consent culture, another option is to build alternate spaces. You could have affinity jams, people of color affinity jams, queer affinity jams, jams that are, explicitly inclusive around accessibility for different kinds of disabilities, or you could have just an explicitly consent culture jam, and you could have your own guidelines and have your own structures and processes. So there are different ways to address differences in communities, and you have to really determine at which point does it make sense to actually, not in a divisive way, but just in a way of like creating different opportunities, do your own thing. So again, I don't have like a very specific roadmap for you in terms of like, this is what you need to do to build consent culture in your community. But I'm offering you some different examples or different directions that you can go in depending on your circumstances. And we'll go into your specific circumstances more in small groups in our live Zoom call. Okay, so the next thing I want to talk about is how can the community develop guidelines that both draw from knowledge and wisdom from other communities that are further along in their process, and then also have the guidelines emerge out of the actual context, history, and values and relationships in your community. So what do I mean by that? I think that trying to invent the wheel, trying to start from scratch is foolish when there are so many amazing contact improvisation communities around the world who have done so much deep work around building these brilliant guidelines. So I think that finding guidelines from various communities, using them as templates is wonderful. And I think that, going at it alone from scratch can just be a huge headache. But that being said, copying and pasting the guidelines from another community is, I think, foolhardy because, first of all, another community's guidelines are not completely going to relate to the circumstances of your own community. And also, the process of developing the guidelines in collaboration with the other leadership and with the rest of the community can be an opportunity to build relationships, to build common understanding, shared values, and it also, again, builds more buy-in, right? So just some guidelines from another community kind of being introduced without any context, they're going to be less likely to be followed. Similarly, just think about where you post your guidelines and are they accessible and are people actually reading them? So, if you introduce new guidelines, you might want to actually have people read them aloud in the beginning of classes and jams for a few months just to like get people really acclimated to what they are, not just post them online or on the wall. How can the guidelines be enforceable? So what systems are in place to make the guidelines have teeth? So if you have guidelines, and those are really, they're rules, they're expectations, like this is how we behave, this is how we treat each other, based on shared values. If somebody does not behave in the ways that the guidelines expect, or the way the community is expecting them to behave, what are the consequences? And this goes into a whole conversation around punitive measures versus consequences. And, I'm very much against recapitulating methods from the prison industrial complex in our artistic and activist communities. I think that is just like horrible when we enact that kind of oppression on each other through call-out culture and through shunning. I think that is not, I do not support that. But that being said, I still think that there can be a way to, in a healthy way, enact consequences for certain actions. So for example, if somebody is continuously touching people without their consent or in ways that they don't want, and then maybe there are some interventions, some conversations that happen, and they continuously behave this way, there might be a consequence that for a period of time they're not invited back to certain spaces. Or perhaps they're not invited to spaces where the people who have expressed grievances show up. I mean, there's so many different ways to negotiate this. I highly recommend, though, that if anyone expresses a grievance against somebody in terms of enacting a boundary violation, that you don't involve the person who's been trespassed in like engaging with the person who they've experienced the trespass with. So I think that it's really useful to have buffers for both people, to have supports, and for communication to happen consensually. So not coercing anyone into any kind of mediation or conflict resolution that they're not interested in. And we can talk in more detail about that in the Zoom call, but I just wanted to mention that part of the consequences in relation to the guidelines are an expression of a community's values. So how do you want to follow through on these values that you're stating in your guidelines? Another question I have for you to think about is how to address harm that's already occurred before there were guidelines. Maybe your community already has guidelines. Maybe you're just revamping them. Maybe leadership has changed. But if situations have changed, if circumstances have changed, chances are there are unresolved instances of harm that some people are carrying with them. Maybe they're still in the community, maybe they no longer show up. But having methods and processes not just to address harm that could happen in the future through the guidelines, but also thinking through how to address harm that might have already happened, I think is a very important step in building a strong consent culture. So, the last bullet here that you'll be seeing in your outline is how to discern when outside help is needed. So I can offer some examples of different kinds of outside help that you might call on, different kinds of mediators or facilitators. I think that calling on outside help, I like to do that more as a default. So rather than waiting until things get really hairy, because again, talking about power dynamics, sometimes people who are facilitators in communities could be the very people that some people feel have enacted harm. And so it's often just like a very safe and wonderful assumption to make that just bringing in an outside facilitator could be a great move. So these are just some questions and ideas as springboards from which you can start to build your plan for your community. And then in the next section, I'm just going to share a few of the exercises that I do in CI consent classes. I just had a granola bar and I feel a lot better. And I'd like to share some of the exercises with you that I offer in my CI teaching in CI consent classes. And I just want to be clear that these classes are really a support for individuals to gain more personal information about how consent works in themselves and in relation to others, but it is not a substitute for systemic change in communities, which really involves buy-in from everyone and also strong leadership. I should say not necessarily buy-in from everyone, because I think that it's possible that some people might not come along for the ride, and I think that's also okay. But these classes that I offer are wonderful opportunities for people to really embody what consent could feel like in themselves. But only so many people show up, and they're just maybe a couple of hours, and it's not really like the work. But I think it's a really important adjunct to the work, or a support for the work. So one of the exercises that I like to offer, either as a warm-up or a cool-down, is I ask people to journal for a few minutes to check in with their bodies and just discover for themselves what they really need or want in that moment. And it could be in a CI context, it could be a certain kind of dance, it could be a certain kind of touch. It could also be just simply like the desire to continue to journal or go on a walk, or maybe people check in and realize like, wow, I'm really hungry, or God, I really need a nap, So some of the needs that could arise are, oh, I feel so much tension in my shoulders. I wish someone would work that out. Ooh, yeah. So people do that individually and then come together in partners. Sometimes I ask people to come together in partners using like really arbitrary methods, like find someone with a shirt that's a similar color. But I also always give people the invitation that they could do the practice solo, that they could witness other people in the practice, so they don't have to do this in partnership. But if it's of interest, it's really super exciting, because what happens is people share with each other what came up for them in their journaling, and they take a few minutes to negotiate a shared activity. And sometimes the shared activity, it just organically works out, like, oh yeah, I really need some body work. I need some body work. Let's do a trade. Great. That's what we're going to do for our 20 minutes together. Sometimes the needs are super divergent. And how does that negotiation take place? So maybe somebody says, I really need a nap. Oh, I really wanted to go outside. Well, maybe they do halvesies, like, okay, I'm going to just do your thing for half the time and do your thing for half the time. Maybe the two people separate. Maybe they come up with some third idea that is completely different. But in that negotiation process, I think it's an opportunity to learn so much about yourself in terms of your ability to identify what you need and to assert it, or to make asks, your ability to take no for an answer, or to, say no. And then of course, as the partners start to engage in the shared activity, that the consent is like an ongoing dialogue. That it's not like, okay, we decided to do this thing, it's a yes. But that like throughout, people are invited to really share their experience and to ask for accommodations or negotiate change. I find that exercise to be really exciting and also vulnerable at times for people, but ultimately really satisfying. So another exercise I like to offer is a yes-no exercise that I modified from a Theater of the Oppressed exercise. And so essentially, people work in partners first without touch, just proximity and distance and negative space. And one person will take a shape, and then the other person will take a shape nearby. And then the first person will either say yes or no. And they're saying yes or no based on their proprioceptive or kinesthetic desire. It's not an intellectual thing. It's not like, oh, this is a beautiful shape, but rather like, oh, I feel good in this relationship with you right now. And it's done very slowly, so people can really take time to check in. And then this person might say yes. And in that case, the second person stays, and then the first person then takes a shape. And then this person might say no. And so then they have to try again. No. Yes. And then it just goes back and forth, right? And so people are just saying yes and no. And it's really about kind of like the exercise we did at the beginning of just checking in with our position in the room and just noticing like, how does our body feel in this particular place? And it doesn't have to make intellectual sense. But then in the exercise, they start to let go of the verbal yes and no, and it's really just about one person moving and another, using proximity and distance as a yes and no. So if somebody's moving away, that might be a no. And then it starts to blur into continuous movement. But at any point, someone can, ask for a pause or say no, or say, can we modify this somehow? The last thing I'll share with you is from a class that I offer called Matching Tone, Matching Power. And the premise of that class is that a lot of dances that don't feel good, in my opinion, can really be traced to a mismatched body tone and maybe, you know, a lack of consent around body tone. So body tone can be about somebody's, you know, muscularity or the speed, their nervous system tone, like the speed with which they're moving, the qualities and the different kinds of amounts of weight that they're offering. And so in matching tone, matching power, we really play with objects, you know, therabands, pulling therabands and creating different amounts of tension and noticing like what amount of tension feels good for you, and balls and compressing balls between bodies. And then we work a lot with body work. So using passive movement, so I'm pretending to passively move my arm, you know, to notice different people's resting body tone, because from one person to another, and also one body part to another within one person, there can be so many different kinds of resting tone in terms of the readiness of the muscles to move or to be at rest. And then we work with active supported movement. So, you know, one person's moving, the other person's just following the movement and noticing like, how does this person move and what is their tone in their movement choices? And doing that also with multiple partners can just illuminate so much about how we interface with different qualities and what our affinities are. And then we offer a lot of verbal feedback in this as well, as a way of attuning to, like, you know, somebody's body tone isn't fixed. Like, people have a lot of choice, and people have more choice than they know. So working with modulating tone and creating more softness or more tension, and being in dialogue about like how much you want and asking for it. And then the last thing we work with is active resisted movement. So let's say, you know, this person's moving and then this person is actually meeting their movement with resistance. And through that resistance, you can find really wonderful fulcrums and opportunities for weight sharing. And, you know, if you match tone, you find stillness. If one person has more tone than the other, you locomote. And through modulating that variation of tone, you find all of the timing and dynamics in a dance. So it's really, for me, like the ingredients of dance making, but just with this lens or this layer of like, how can we listen through our body tone, and how can we communicate through our body tone, and how can we depersonalize some of the ways that we might dislike certain dances. So it's not like necessarily that the other person just stinks, you know. It can also be that like, oh, it's a mismatched body tone. Maybe it's not a match for today. Maybe the answer is no, we shouldn't dance together. You know, one person's feeling very languid, another person's feeling very, you know, upbeat and flighty, and maybe that's a mismatch. But if the two people want to dance together, how can they find some way to meet each other? These are the questions that I have. So trying to find answers around consent through embodiment. That's my research right now, and I haven't completely figured it out, but it's been really delightful to work with dancers on it in class. So we're nearing the end of this presentation, and just want to share briefly a little bit about visioning the future. So, you know, I'm talking about individuals in classes, individual exchanges, individual dances, or maybe individual communities. But what does this work mean for the international CI community? So, I mean, I think the word community is a bit fraught, because what does it mean? Who's in, who's out? But I do believe that through events like this Consent Culture Symposium, that there can be more dissemination of ideas into the broader CI international world around what consent culture could look like and how to get there. And so what I'd like to do together in our live session is to do some solo journaling, which you can do prior to the session, but you don't have to prepare. You can just show up and I'll ask you some questions to just reflect on what your experience has been personally around consent, what you want to be working on in terms of getting better about listening, or what you would need to feel safer in CI spaces. journaling about your identity, who you are, and what brings you to the symposium, and what your goals are. And then in small breakout groups, we're going to identify and address some of the challenges that you see in your hometown CI community, and looking at that through some of the questions that I asked during the strategy section. And then we're going to do a group visioning exercise, imagining a future CI world that embodies a culture of consent. So dreaming up our future together. And I'm not going to speak much more about that because I kind of want that to be a surprise, but just to give you a sense of what we're going to be doing together. And to close, I would like to finish off with a return to that solo embodiment consent exercise. So as I take a drink of water, you can also notice what kind of care your body, mind, or heart needs right now. You might want to think through what you've experienced in this session, in this lecture, in terms of what it's brought up for you in your emotional body. So it's been a bit academic, but you can also just notice what you're feeling, and notice, think about or feel into what kind of support you might need after the session in order to process anything that's come up for you. And then again, check in with your sense of your place in space. Do you still like where you are? I'm really into where I am. I'm in front of a wallpaper mural that I put in my office, and I've been really enjoying watching the light change over the course of this session. And I like being here. But if you feel like where you're at maybe is suddenly you notice like, oh, actually I'd rather be lying down, or I'd rather be closing my eyes. I should have said that at the beginning, that you could listen to this whole thing with your eyes closed. Hopefully you know that. And just check in once again with your posture. So your sense of your body and space, your position in space, your breathing, your relationship to whatever's supporting you, chair, floor, wall, and noticing if there are any shifts that you want to make toward more comfort or ease. And if for any reason you notice like, oh no, I've been sitting in the same position for an hour and I'm like in pain, try to be kind to yourself. Like, you know, we all sometimes override our sensation for the sake of some external goal, like listening to a presentation or understanding, maybe even sitting with your head a little bit like this. So don't beat up on yourself if you've done anything that was like less than ideal in terms of self-care, but just notice in this moment what you might be able to do to meet your needs, to respect your bodily freedom and autonomy. And I'll just also say in closing that we will have time in the online session, in the live session, to share. Some of you watching this might be watching from the future, like after the symposium has happened. Whether you're watching this after the symposium has already happened, or if you are still planning on, coming to the symposium, it hasn't happened yet, I'd like to invite you that you're welcome to email me if you want to share. If you want to share, my email's my name, NicoleBindler@gmail.com. You can also go to my website, NicoleBindler.com, and message me from there. And yeah, I welcome dialogue. I welcome questions. I welcome healthy, respectful debate. If there's anything I've said that you're like, no, that's not true, I'd be super interested in hearing if anything didn't ring true for you, or if you have, a different experience. So, I really believe that this body work that I'm doing is it's like a living, breathing, evolving thing, and it keeps changing every time I offer it. And because of this dreaded COVID-19 virus that is drastically changing our world. It's creating conditions in which, we're being nimble, we're creating solutions to meet each other, but this is not a classroom environment. This is not a dialogue. And so that's something that I've really missed in this 45 minutes to an hour of sharing with you, that I would love feedback. So anything that you'd like to share with me, please feel free. And be well, and I look forward to connecting with you sometime soon.